Now, from the University of Virginia Center for Politics.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this special event on domestic terrorism hosted by the University of Virginia Center for Politics. My name is Chris Krebs. I am currently a resident scholar at the Center for Politics. I am formerly the director of the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and I'm also a 1999 graduate of the College of Arts and Sciences. It is appropriate, I think, that UVA hosts this event, given that Charlottesville was the scene of 5 years ago, the Unite the Right rally that resulted in a number of casualties, including the death of one attendee. So with that, I want to lay down some context for the conversation we're going to have tonight. So one of the first things that President Biden did, in fact, on his first day in office, was directed his national security team to lead a 100-day review of U.S. government efforts to address domestic terrorism. That resulted in a national strategy to counter domestic terrorism, which was released last summer. But this is not simply a Biden administration issue. The Trump administration, in fact, also recognized the increase in domestic terrorism and extremism. And following the tragic shooting at a Walmart in El Paso, Texas, the Department of Homeland Security released the DHS Strategic Framework for Countering Terrorism and Targeted Violence, explicitly calling out the growing threat from domestic terrorism and targeted violence. And yet, to put this even more recent context, it does seem that the domestic extremist threat has taken on a new urgency of late. Just last fall, FBI Director Chris Wray told Congress that the domestic terrorism caseload for the FBI has exploded in the 2020 to 2021 timeframe. So it's with this background that we approach today's conversation. We have two experts here today, and we'll talk about the threat, the challenges posed by domestic terrorism, and the government's role in countering domestic terrorism. So our first panelist for the discussion today, this evening, is Dr. Mary McCord. She's the executive director of the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection and a visiting professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center. Previously, Mary was an assistant U.S. attorney for nearly 20 years at the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia. She's written about domestic terrorism, unlawful militia activity, public safety, and the rule of law. Mary received the Oliver Whitehill Courageous Advocate Award from the Virginia Trial Lawyers Association in 2018, based on her work with ICAP litigating against white supremacists and private militias that attended the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. Mary graduated from the Georgetown University Law School and served as a law clerk for George Thomas Hogan of the United States District Court for the District of Columbia. Our next guest is Clint Watts. Clint is a NBC national security contributor and a leader of MIBURO. And Clint, you can correct my pronunciation later, but it's a team of researchers. It's a team that researches disinformation and extremism. Before becoming a consultant, Clint served as a U.S. Army infantry officer, a FBI special agent, and is the executive officer of the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point as a consultant to the FBI's Counterterrorism Division and National Security Branch. He's also an analyst supporting the U.S. intelligence community and U.S. Special Operations Command. Clint attended West Point and received his master's from Middlebury Institute of International Studies. Okay, as I mentioned, what I'd like to talk about tonight, we'll start with the threat. We'll then talk about the challenges associated with countering domestic terrorism, and then we'll talk about the government's role and some of the newer initiatives that the government has underway. So Clint, if you don't mind, I'll start with you. You've been on TV a lot lately, doing your best Steve Kornacki on NBC, walking viewers through the crisis in Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But before today's crisis, you've been a frequent contributor and commentator, and you've taken a hard look at political violence and domestic terrorism challenges for the last several years. You testified in front of the Senate Homeland Security Committee in 2019, in fact, on this very issue. So let's start broad. What are the domestic threats that we should be looking at and we should be considering? And what are a few examples of some prior attacks, and where do you see this going?
Yeah, so thanks, Chris, for having me, and appreciate being here. UVA waitlisted me when I was in high school, so I'm thrilled to be here tonight and actually finally make the triumph of being at UVA in one form or another. But big fan of the school. Went there when I was a young person, and it always stuck with me what an amazing university it is. So, what I find interesting about today's domestic terrorism landscape is that it's larger in number and more diverse in breadth than at any time that I can think of in U.S. history, and particularly over the last few decades. I would also say that it is eerily similar to actually the 1990s to some degree, which is when I met my very first FBI agent. Long before I ever went to the FBI Academy, I met an FBI agent who showed up at the 101st Airborne Division and wanted to know about a guy named Roberts. And later in the Army, I ran into another FBI agent who wanted to know about a guy named Timothy McVeigh. And then later, just down the street was a guy named Kevin Harflam. And so what's interesting about this, all three of those individuals had a military background, and all of them, were related to domestic terrorist attacks, essentially, but they were treated as sort of single individuals. But they're never lone wolves. They may be lonely, but they're not alone in terms of how they operate. They always come from a larger ideological sect. And the one big difference between today versus 30 years ago, when I was in the Army, is they're connected on the internet and social media. So it's much more tight. It moves much quicker, and it's much more dynamic. I think the biggest thing to look at is that we tend to think of terrorists as groups or terrorist organizations, and Al Qaeda and ISIS were always like the central in our mind during the international terrorist fight. But oftentimes you go ask some individual in the United States, do you support Al Qaeda? And they'd say yes, and be like, who are you talking to in Al Qaeda? And they would be like, do you know someone in Al Qaeda? Like the answer would be like all backwards. They didn't actually have like a physical connection. And this is the late 2000s, early 2010s, in the era of Anwar al-Awlaki, which started off what was known as mediated terrorism, this era of mediated terrorism, where someone can push the idea out, hey, wouldn't it be great to do a terrorist attack in the United States? And then someone who's a supporter of that ideology on their own might operate or plan or connect with other people that are like-minded on social media and execute that attack. Today, that bottom up rather than top down is more reflective in the domestic space in certain corners. And in other corners, for the first time after January 6th, we see top down again in a way that we really hadn't seen since the 1990s. So there's two variables, I think, to think about when looking at domestic extremist scene. One is age. The age matters because the older they tend to skew, the more organized they tend to be. And that's the second variable, which is how do they organize? The younger they tend to skew, the more online and actually disconnected they are in the physical world, but highly connected in the virtual world. So what I see is kind of different groups, and you'll hear Director Ray, he does an amazing job of briefing this, that they police violence and not ideas, because a lot of these ideas are protected free speech. And so when I would go out and train law enforcement after I was working at the FBI Academy and FBI headquarters, you have to talk about what is domestic terrorism and how do we get to a point where we can define what it is. Because if you went on Twitter at any given moment, someone's calling somebody a terrorist for some reason or another, but it usually just means they don't like the other person. But terrorism is the pursuit of, political change, something that differs from the norm to the extreme, and it's over a political, social, ideological sort of cause, usually a religion, and it's in the pursuit of violence, meaning they have resolved to commit violence to, perpetrate these acts. And that's where the real tough part comes today. So in the older quadrant, more organized is kind of the way I think about it. Those are your militia violent extremists, which up until recently were largely for show. You might remember if you go back in history books, the Michigan militia, which was right around the 2000s. There were some FBI cases out of the Detroit office. There was an element of that, but not much. The Branch Davidian compound, another one. The standoff in Idaho, but these were small and kind of dispersed. They were unique in a certain way and odd. Now I think you see these militia groups much more organized and always pushing right up to what is protected free speech and protected use of weapons or Second Amendment rights. But then occasionally you'll see one, two, or maybe a dozen, if it's the case of January 6th, committing violence. What I have noticed is there's lots of splinters in the ranks over the last year since January 6th, where you see them dividing. And usually the younger they are, the more extreme their behavior. And the older they are, the more they've gone back towards what would be seen as peaceful assembly with an AR-15 or demonstrations. There's a lot of tumult in the ranks. That's particularly around the organized extremist groups that showed up on January 6th. The group that worries me the most is not a group, it's what's called stochastic terrorism. So stochastic terrorism is essentially, there's a broad-based ideology, there's tons of threats, and there's tons of people making threats. But on any given day where you see one actor commit an act of terrorism, go ahead and perpetrate violence, they're usually doing it alone by themselves as a lone actor. That's almost random and hard to detect because they hadn't committed a crime to that point. They're not known oftentimes to law enforcement. So it's a very difficult problem. And those ideologically span all the way across the board from white supremacists, I think being the most dangerous, to incel, misogynist hate groups that essentially assemble online and take the violence out in a dedicated and targeted way, to even anarchist groups, which do a version of this. And the most confusing one of these is the Boogaloo movement, which you've probably heard of, which has some variants of kind of being, anti-government to a degree, but having one-off actors, for example, that are former military that go and kill other law enforcement individuals. Very odd to see that sort of pairing. So in that, I think the real thing to watch for and what I'm most worried about is the white supremacist strain ideologically and the younger generation, which seems to be organizing in smaller collectives at times and moving into that more organized way. And the other part about it is they don't fear using weapons. They have easy access to targets and weaponry. Never saw this during the international terrorism days. If you look back at part of the reason we saw things like trucks running people over or people trying to use vehicles or other mechanisms for homicides, they didn't have access to weapons or targets. That was always the struggle for a lot of international extremists. The domestic extremists have it by the bucket loads. They have access to everything they need. The last thing, and I don't want to go on too long, but is the idea of contagion, or what I would call cascading terrorism, meaning one successful stochastic attack convinces someone else that's considering to do it to go ahead and move and execute an attack. They see the fame, they see the glory, they see that someone else has done it, and they want to jump into that action. And so that's why you oftentimes will see a single actor or a single attack execute, and shortly after you'll see another one execute. That always brings a lot of fear in me when I see one that's successful, because in that online environment, you see them essentially call themselves saints, and the manifestos of each of the people that are seen as successful to terrorist attacks from their perspective, them being motivated to mobilize to violence. And so I think that's why it's really important to, stay ahead of this and think about how do we preempt this? And the number one way to preempt this is to take the temperature down in political dialogue to a great degree. I think that's the biggest thing that I've noticed over the last year compared to 2019, which was a summer that was absolutely insane, with lots of one-off shooters going in, hitting lots of different targets based on race, religion, or political ideology. It's no coincidence that when people stop designating targets, particularly political leaders, you oftentimes have a large downtick in the number of people that are targeted with violence.
So you've laid out a number of ideology aspects of this, kind of the techniques and the radicalization paths, and there are a couple of things I want to come back to you in a minute to unpack a little bit. But Mary, let's go to you now. So in the many hats you've worn for the Department of Justice, you led the Department of Justice's National Security Division, a role now filled by UVA alum Matt Olson, right up until the Unite the Right rally. And you've spoken a lot about that and how influential that event was. You've been right in the middle of this. And so my sense is that even since 2017, between now and then, we've seen a dramatic acceleration in threats and threat actor capabilities. So with that in mind, and with some of the context I think that Clint laid out, what's keeping you up at night right now? What are the real threats we should be concerned about? When you think about the title of the event, how vulnerable are we?
Thanks, Chris, and nice to be here. When we're on the topic of UVA, my daughter is going to graduate in, I guess, a month and is very excited from UVA. My older son graduated a few years ago, so I didn't go there, but lots in the family are there. So what keeps me up at night? I think that we are in a time, I used to worry most coming while I was at DOJ and in the first few years after it about the actual acts of violence, the mass shootings, the one-off shootings, the plots to, bomb a police station or a military station. Those are still real threats. There's no question about it. And I do think oftentimes I agree with Clint, there's a lone actor in the sense a lone person might go do it, but he or she is inspired by and communicating with and involved in a subculture of extremism well before they decide to go ahead and take that action. But I think that we need to start thinking about the domestic extremist threat beyond that point of a mass shooting or an act of violence, because the extremist threat is actually over these last few years, particularly 2020, 21, and now, becoming a real threat to democratic processes. And this is what I mean about this. We have seen different groups, different ideological groups of extremists who normally would not necessarily agree on lots of things, coalescing together, putting aside their differences in ideology in favor of taking certain positions on the culture wars that benefit them, that give them more access and that give them more power, which is why I think we were able to see something like January 6th happen. But, Charlottesville really was a start of this, right? Because that rally was supposed to be this chance for white nationalists to step out of the virtual space and into the physical space, show that they were more than just a meme, more than just a bunch of people, fantasizing over social media, and actually come together, show that they had power. And they used the excuse of the city of Charlottesville's decision to take down Confederate monuments as their reason to come to Charlottesville and protest that decision. And what we saw not only neo-Nazis, neo-Confederates, accelerationists, skinheads. We also saw militia extremists joining in this. Now, they would say, we weren't there for ideological reasons. We were just there to protect the First Amendment rights of the protesters. But that was a choice that they made. And they deployed heavily armed, by their own accounts, 60 to 80 pounds of equipment. We're talking about AR-15s and multiple magazines and sidearms and full military kits and helmets and radios for communications and combat boots, etc. And they took up a perimeter and they interposed themselves between protesters and counter-protesters and arrogated to themselves without any lawful authority the determination when and under what circumstances to use that lethal force. And so that sort of beginning to cement these relationships between white supremacist groups and militias. Now, I'm not going to say they didn't have the relationships before. I mean, if we want to talk about Oklahoma City bombing, right? Timothy McVeigh was a white supremacist. He had also grown up in militias in Michigan and was very anti-government. So the anti-government and white supremacist views don't always align, but they have historically gone hand in hand. But here we saw like a willingness to be out in public aligned together. And we've just seen that grow in the ensuing years, particularly in from 2017 to 2020, we saw, deployments to the border by self-professed militias to augment the forces of a border patrol because that aligned with their anti-immigrant and anti-other views. And they would actually detain migrants unlawfully with no authority whatsoever and hold them for border patrol. We saw, going out and performing security at different rallies, White Lives Matter rallies, KKK rallies, Patriot Prayer rallies in the Pacific Northwest, Proud Boys events, more and more of these coalitions. But then as 2020 hit, we saw the pandemic, the murder of George Floyd, and then the Stop the Steal movement, all as additional coalition forces that really expanded the pool of extremists willing to work together. So then now we started seeing militia extremists, white supremacists, accelerationists, conspiracy theorists, including QAnon, all circulating each other's social media reposting each other's social media, sometimes on open platforms, sometimes in private chat rooms, often in private chat rooms. My organization works with a lot of researchers who are looking at this kind of material and passing it along when it's an alarming, and we pass it along to law enforcement and also to communities to help them to prepare. But to see them to sometimes put aside what may be otherwise their differences to come together is where we really started seeing power out in public. And to just differentiate this, Clint raised like the standoffs, the malicious standoffs in Waco, Texas, and Ruby Ridge. And I would add to that the standoffs at Bunkerville, Nevada, and much more recently, 2014, and Malheur Wildlife Refuge, 2016, both when I was at the Department of Justice in the National Security Division. These were basically armed standoffs against federal agents about, federal uses of federal land. The rest of the public was pretty uninvolved and not really threatened. The federal agents were definitely threatened. It was a dangerous situation. But what's the difference now is we're seeing heavily armed militias aligned with other extremists and interfacing with the public in a much more regular basis and in ways that threaten other people's, not just their public safety, but their constitutional rights. So, for example, well before January 6th, think about the storming the State House in Lansing, Michigan, in opposition to Governor Whitmer's shutdown orders right after the pandemic began. Storming the State House while armed in Boise, Idaho, breaking windows, terrifying lawmakers as well as people who were trying to come there to exercise their First Amendment right to petition their government and had to run this gauntlet of militias. We see them coming out at protest events, supposedly to protect property or protect statues, again, with no authority, and sometimes with tragic results, like in Kenosha, where 3 people were shot, 2 were killed, 1 seriously injured. So this alliance with other extremist ideologies and willingness to deploy and use force, or that projection of the ability to use force against others while armed, I think is a threat not just to public safety, not just to national security, which we've seen, but also just to constitutional rights, to our very core of democracy. And we're seeing this more and more now too, as we see extremists running for, just trying to displace election officials and elected officials in many states, election deniers running for those positions where they will be the ones responsible for actually tabulating the votes and certifying the votes. So I think we need to broaden our perspective of looking at domestic extremism and to take these things into consideration.
So I want to do a quick deep dive with each of you on the tools that domestic extremists and domestic terrorists in particular use. So Mary, I'll come back to you in just a second, but Clint, can you talk about the physical tools? What are the specific techniques we're seeing? So historically, when you think about international terrorism, you read about vehicle-borne IEDs. You've touched on this. We've heard about lone wolves and complex coordinated attacks like in Mumbai. Here, we've seen pressure cooker bombs in Boston and vehicle rammings in Charlottesville and IEDs in Oklahoma City. So what are the physical tools of today's threats? And Mary, be thinking about the digital tools of today's threats as well.
That's right, Chris. So what's interesting is the weapons and sort of weaponry and the capabilities, and I'll stay away from the technology side of it, that are available to domestic extremists are next level compared to international extremists. I remember in the early 2000s how we would go trying to pan out every potential weapon or device that might be used in one way or another by an international terrorist. A domestic terrorist already has them. So it's a totally different, scenario in terms of how it's flipped. For the most part, when you watch their training videos, what used to be an Al-Qaeda cell is maybe doing paintball is literally just a domestic terrorist group that is doing shooting drills as if they're part of a military organization, and they film themselves doing it. And so that's odd, because we would watch that in the international context and we would be so concerned that, they might do this on other Americans. And then you have the Wolverine militia, some of these other groups, they're doing, combat drills out of cars that look exactly like you would get in military training. And so I think the other part that isn't really thought of, but is very apparent once you start to look at it, is many or most of them have some kind of military training to some degree. Eric Rudolph, Timothy McVeigh, Kevin Harfum, all of them in the Army. Many of the others, the gentleman that was part of the Boogaloo, member of the Air Force. I think the part is the training. The access to weapons is ubiquitous for domestic extremists. Their ability to put together and build complex IEDs, next level compared to international terrorists. Kevin Harfum's device that he tried to put in a Martin Luther King parade in Spokane was, the most sophisticated IED that's probably been seen for the most part in the U.S. at that time. And now there are other variants or versions of that you've seen people put together. The other part is that terrorists learn from each other. So some of the ideas of Al-Qaeda or ISIS that didn't even take off, you will see domestic extremists cite it as something that they could do or could also use. And so Inspire was a magazine that you might remember from about 10 years ago. Inspire as a magazine still provides a script that you can have a domestic terrorist group use, and they do pay attention to these things. The other part is they just have a more permissive environment to do rehearsals, to do reconnaissance, and to try out new devices and techniques. This just would not happen. If you were a potential Al-Qaeda or ISIS suspect and you went to a gun range or a quarry, if you blew up a device out in a rural area, you would be called into the FBI. Today, that doesn't necessarily happen. It's seen as just part and parcel of their belief system to a degree. So they have access to weapons, munitions. They have pretty much all the tricks under the sun, and you even see them showing up in body armor. I mean, this is just kind of next level. You just didn't really see them as taking it to this level even 20 to 30 years ago. All of that is accessible to this point. And so the technology and the communications, the digital age, it makes it even more. They learn very quickly. It's just kind of depressing, the fact that there almost is no weaponry, there's no tool, there's no form of violence that is not available to them at this point.
So Mary, with that in mind, and again, talking about the technology tools, the digital tools, anything you'd like to add and where your head's at on this?
Thank you. One of the things that I think is very similar, though, to recent international terrorism, so ISIS, which is very different from the years that Al-Qaeda was our primary concern. With ISIS, what we saw that was new was, they took advantage of the internet. They used social media and internet chats and encrypted communications to recruit, to propagandize, to plot and to plan and to help people get over to Syria, or to encourage them to commit attacks in their own homelands, particularly in the US and places as they crack down on foreign terrorist fighters. And we see that with domestic extremists as well, right? So they have thoroughly, capitalized on the availability to communicate without ever meeting in person. They still do go out and meet in person, but they can do so much more. Again, propagandizing, recruiting, planning, plotting. And if you look, when I was at DOJ, every single terrorism case that we brought involving ISIS had a component of internet platforms, social media communications as either the background to how the person became radicalized, and oftentimes also how that person became involved in either trying to travel, acquire weapons to use in a terrorist attack, etc. We see the same thing if you look, for example, at the indictments coming out of January 6th, the seditious conspiracy indictments and other conspiracy indictments. And in other conspiracies involving domestic extremists, you see that ubiquitous use of social media and the internet. And the impact of disinformation is so great here, because it was with ISIS as well. It was a different type of disinformation, but it was disinformation that was used, and they could target different audiences based on who was going to be vulnerable to different kinds of disinformation. And the same is the case here. And so, this is something that, and this happened back with the heyday of ISIS as well. Our technology platforms and social media, they were just really slow to react to this. And, I remember in my role going out to Silicon Valley and meeting with leaders at various firms and asking them to, take this stuff down. And now we're, it's feel like we just are doing the whole thing over again with the domestic threat. Now, they will say, oh, First Amendment, but these are private tech companies. They can take down, whatever they want to take down. They're not bound by the First Amendment. So that's something that I understand they like First Amendment values, but they've been really slow, I think, to recognize the misuse of their platforms by extremists. We did see in October 2020, Facebook, now Meta, making a change in its dangerous individuals and organizations policy and taking down lots and lots of Facebook pages and groups, including militias and other extremist groups, QAnon, for example. But it's very easy for them to pop back up, and it's not really well policed. So I think the impact there and its ability to really spread the threat and magnify the threat is something that is very unlike sort of more of our historical analogs. The other thing, if I can just mention, because Clint was talking a lot about the access to weapons and so many other tools of violence in the U.S. and the mustering and the trainings that we're seeing by militia extremist groups. This is an area where there is a lot of misunderstandings about what is protected by the First and Second Amendment. This is something, our case that we brought in Charlottesville against, on behalf of the city, small businesses and residential associations against militia and paramilitary white supremacist organizations was based on state anti-militia law. It's based on conduct that is not authorized, not protected by the Second Amendment, dangerous to public safety. It's not based on viewpoint. In fact, although almost all of the 23 defendants were white nationalists or aligned with white nationalists, there was one leftist militia that was also a defendant in that case because they were doing the same thing. And so these laws exist. All 50 states have some provision in their constitution that requires military to always be strictly subordinate to the civilian authority, meaning the governor. 29 states have an anti-militia law. 25 states have anti-paramilitary activity laws. States have laws against the false assumption of the functions of law enforcement, but these are very rarely enforced. We're working right now with a DA in Bernalillo County, New Mexico, in an action against a militia there that was involved in a racial justice demonstration that resulted in a shooting. So part of it is, this misunderstanding that militia activity is protected by the Second Amendment. But the Supreme Court's been quite clear in upholding anti-militia laws back all the way as far back as 1886 that private paramilitary organizations aren't protected. The Supreme Court said at the time, states have to be able to regulate them and prohibit them in order to protect public safety, peace, and good order. And Justice Scalia in 2008, writing in the last major Second Amendment case decided by the Supreme Court, we're going to have another one coming up this term, but said even then, hearkened back to that 1886 case and said, no one here is even arguing that the Second Amendment protects private paramilitary organizations. And, what we said back in 1886 still holds. States can prohibit them. And that's not even questioned. So I think we need to be more rigorous, in the law enforcement community, in the public safety community, and in the population of understanding that this is not protected activity. It threatens public safety, but it also threatens constitutional rights.
Well, I can't imagine a better transition to the next discussion we're going to have about the challenges. And it kind of dawned on me there a few minutes ago that we may be in the midst of a master class on domestic terrorism issues in the United States. So again, thanks to Clint and Mary for joining us this evening. So let's do this. Let's talk about the challenges posed by domestic terrorism. And as much as we talk about this issue and we hear it discussed, on the news and elsewhere, it's still not really all that clear cut as I see it. Everything from common definitions to a shared understanding of what can be done about it within the four corners of the Constitution, as you were just talking about, Mary. It still remains challenging. Even a little bit of what I've done tonight, maybe you all have done it either intentionally or unintentionally, but the almost interchangeability of domestic extremism and domestic terrorism. So Mary, you wrote a great lawfare piece in 2017 on how criminal law should treat domestic terrorism as the moral equivalent of international terrorism. And you've argued for domestic terrorism to be a federal crime. I'll let you, if I've missed that at all, I'll let you correct it. But can you give us a sense of what's missing right now in the federal code? Why is this so complicated? You both talked about First Amendment protections in particular. And what does Congress need to do, if anything, to right size the law?
No, it's a great question. So we have lots of federal crimes of terrorism. We have over 50 that are some of them are in a chapter of the code called terrorism. Some are elsewhere, but are designated as federal crimes of terrorism. But not one of those 51 crimes of terrorism applies to a crime of violence committed to intimidate or coerce or influence a policy of government through intimidation or coercion, which is like the statutory definition of terrorism. Not one of those applies if the crime of violence is committed with a firearm, unless it is done on behalf of a designated foreign terrorist organization or targeting a U.S. government official or U.S. government property. So that means the most common form of terrorist attack in the territorial U.S., a mass shooting, even just a smaller shooting with a firearm, is not going to be a crime of terrorism unless somebody pledged bayat to a foreign terrorist organization. And I say pledged bayat because almost every organization on the list is an Islamist extremist organization. So the biggest example, or a very readily understandable example of the sort of moral lack of equivalence, is the El Paso shooting, right? If the El Paso shooter had pledged bayat to Baghdadi, the then leader of ISIS, right before his rampage, killing 23 people, he would be charged with multiple crimes of terrorism. But he didn't. He did his shooting because he was afraid of what he called a Latino invasion across the southwest border. He wanted to create a white ethno-state. He hearkened in his manifesto to other white supremacist terrorists around the world, and he didn't pledge bayat to any foreign terrorist organization. So even though he committed lots of crimes, 23 murders, hate crimes, there's nothing he committed that is designated a crime of terrorism. So you could say, well, that doesn't matter. He's still prosecuted. That's right. He will still be prosecuted. It's not on a moral equivalency. It sends sort of a message that Islamist extremism is terrorism and white supremacy extremism, violence is something else. But more importantly is not what we have to prosecute somebody after the mass shooting. It's what do we have to investigate and thwart the terrorist attack before they happen. And this is where I do think there's a gap that is worth considering filling. But I will tell you, the opposition for the civil rights and civil liberties community, which frankly I consider myself part of that community, is so great to creating any new criminal offenses because of distrust of law enforcement, because of fear that those offenses will be used against Black and brown people, that they would rather have the lack of moral equivalency than have a new terrorism statute. But the gap, if I can just spell it out, is if you had a crime of terrorism that applied to all crimes of violence done with the intent to intimidate or coerce a civilian population or influence a policy of government through intimidation and coercion, which again, that is the statutory definition of terrorism. If you had that applicable to all such crimes in the territorial US, regardless of ideology, right, then it wouldn't matter if it was on behalf of a foreign terrorist organization or not. It would apply to attempts and it would apply to conspiracies. But more importantly, it would then be a predicate crime of terrorism for another crime that already exists on the books, and that is material support to terrorists. Not material support to a foreign terrorist organization, but material support to terrorists. Because that statute says that it's unlawful to provide material support or resources or to disguise the nature of resources. So think AR-15s, other, material for committing crimes of violence. It's illegal to disguise those resources knowing and intending that they're to be used in a crime of terrorism. So if terrorism in the territorial US was a crime generally, regardless of what it was used to commit it, firearm, vehicle, bomb, whatever, regardless of ideology, that would be a predicate for those people like Christopher Paul Hassan, who obtained an arsenal of AR-15s and amphetamines in order to commit a series of mass shootings to commit to advance his goal of having a white ethno-state. You would have a crime, a terrorism crime that FBI could be investigating and could charge as a terrorist crime upon thwarting that plan. Members of the base, an accelerationist white supremacist group, right? They did have a plot thwarted right before Lobby Day in Virginia in 2020, just before the pandemic broke out. 3 of them who were plotting, they had built a machine gun. They were plotting to start a civil war during Lobby Day because so many people were coming with the gun lobby in Virginia that had firearms. They thought if they could just hit a few people, they'd start a mass shooting, start a civil war, accelerate toward a white ethno state. Now, they were found out by the FBI. The plot was thwarted, but they're charged with weapons offenses and harboring an alien because one came over illegally from Canada. Nothing that looks like terrorism at all. So we wonder how many things are not getting investigated for the predicates toward that. And is there a place there that it a crime like that could fill the gap? Another, I think, gap filler would be a federal anti-paramilitary bill, because the states just aren't acting, I think, oftentimes for lack of resources, lack of enough information and knowledge to build those cases. It's not the bread and butter of what your local elected district attorneys and police chiefs do. They're usually reacting to crime on the street, not thinking about what are the militias doing. And militias, they travel interstate. We've seen that in every single example in recent history. And so it's really a matter that the federal government should be taking up.
You covered a lot of ground there, and there's one thing in particular that jumped out to me was your discussion of Lobby Day in Richmond, and you mentioned a group called the Base. And so, Clint, let's talk a little bit about the international facets of the domestic threat. So, what are the ties between international groups, white supremacy groups like the Base, accelerationist groups, and what are the related, what are the legal challenges and sensitivities around domestic terrorism versus international terrorism, particularly when the thing about the Base that's just so fascinating is actually as I recall, a Russian-based organization led by an American expat that continues to attempt to inform and influence activity here domestically. And it's almost like, where have I heard this playbook before? So, Clint, can you walk us through this a little bit?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and it shows how ridiculous our system is that Mary's talking about, that we treat them differently when this is almost a mirror pattern of the other base, Al-Qaeda, which also means the base. That's literally what that means, which was the idea that you create a foundational training camp in person and online that facilitates terrorism around the world under an ideology. And that's what the base in the present day is. The gentleman that leads the base, Navarro, he lives in St. Petersburg, Russia, the last we know of it. He is on social media channels and promoting where he's at and the ideology, encouraging people to go to weapons training inside the United States. This would look exactly like Al-Qaeda, except we treat it like totally different. So from an investigative perspective, what's fascinating is the online environment has no borders geographically, and the way they assemble and organize is essentially the same. That same group, the base, has connective tissue all through Europe with far-right and white supremacist groups. The Nordic Front, for example, in Sweden, they sent people to be trained in Russia. What do? They went back to attack a migrant camp using explosive devices. Some of those members of the base, where did they come from? Canada. And they come across the border to join up with other Americans to essentially do training camps. And where do they do it? Well, out in places like Washington. Where have we seen that before? That's where Ruby Ridge was in Spokane. And Spokane is very close to Ruby Ridge, and this Kevin Harfum. So these areas are very well known. And if we were doing this from an international perspective, we'd be talking about countering violent extremism and going and getting out there and knowing the people and talking to them, trying to de-radicalize them. And so it's funny, after the Kevin Harfum case, I was at the National Counterterrorism Center for a panel not that different from this about 10 years ago. I said, when are we going to do CV at Ruby Ridge? And everybody looked at me like I was crazy. I was like, well, Kevin Harfum just came from the same sort of area. We know there's a pattern of extremism there, and they even, vocally talk about being there. Why wouldn't we go knock on doors and talk to the community about how we bring them in so they could help us out? And the answer was they all have guns. And Al-Qaeda and ISIS guys don't. And so it's just very basic. Like when you look at it on the surface, we just turn it 180 degrees. Where the breakdown comes, and that's why I love listening to Mary discuss all of this, like the ways that we could get at it, The way it occurs if you're in the FBI is each individual person, even if they come in on a tip, is treated as a lone individual when we know they're not. That they're part of a broader ideology and network. And then there's no centralized way. I mean, they've gotten better at it with the way the Director Ray has tried to arrange it around the rules. But lacking a foreign terrorist organization designation, you're starting on your heels from the start. For example, if you're an FBI agent, after the Al-Awlaki area, they created an open case called Inspired Terrorism for Al-Qaeda, Inspired Terrorism for ISIS. And that open case allowed the FBI to centralize leads from all over the country, put pieces together, which you have to do in the social media environment to catch people that were communicating or connecting online that never met in person. Today, still really, really challenging to do that if it's a domestic terrorism lead, because no one goes and says the base is a domestic terrorism organization, let's build a case file around it. Instead, they build 30 case files of people that probably are working together but are being treated as individuals. And it makes it very difficult to do intelligence analysis at the federal level to bring all those pieces together. And you have no charge. That's what Mary was saying about. You have no charge to get started on. You have no impetus to move from what we do is an assessment to a preliminary inquiry to a full field investigation. You can't get over those hurdles to even start moving. So this comes back to January 6th. That's why I like this question, is that when you get to January 6th, you or I or Mary, we can all sit at our house and see bad things are coming. We even know who the groups are. We know the leaders because they're saying it on the internet. It's like not a secret. And yet the FBI legally doesn't really have a good impetus by which to launch an investigation. There's no real good grounds to do that unless they've got some lead from before. Now, the one thing January 6th did is it gave them thousands of leads that they could start cases on. That's why you're seeing a lot of the domestic scene unravel so quickly, and you're seeing a lot of people get arrested. But the FBI and Director Ray, they kept trying to hammer him with questions. There's two things that they never answer when they do these hearings. What is domestic terrorism in the United States? What is the charge that I'm allowed to file or create a case around, so that if I had inspired terrorism for domestic terrorism, terrorist organization, what would that be? And what am I allowed to watch? Without that designation, if Director Ray just goes out, or Department of Homeland Security, where you were, Chris, just goes out and starts watching social media, Americans would be like, oh, wait, you're watching, my free speech, and be like, well, that's also how we found Al-Qaeda, because it turns out if the guy's avatar is Osama bin Laden's face, he might be an Al-Qaeda supporter. It's just a hot tip, right? So like the same indicators that we use in the international space, we are just eliminated, and it becomes very difficult to be preemptive with terrorism. So the public has this expectation of 100% privacy, and they also have an expectation of 100% security in the domestic terrorism space. And it's got to somehow get broken down in between. It's really only Congress that can figure out what those rules are. Otherwise, everyone's doing the best they can, but legally they're always on faulty ground if they're trying to be preemptive.
Yeah, and unfortunately, we don't have Larry with us this evening to comment on the likelihood of Congress crafting a sensible piece of legislation that would address that, both from a statutory authorities perspective as well as an operational agency perspective. But let's dive in on that real quickly. And we've got about 12 minutes left here. So the government's responsibilities, it's a complex area. You talked about Homeland, we've talked about DOJ, we've talked about the FBI. We won't even have time tonight to get into the military aspect of this. But last summer, the government released its national strategy for countering domestic terrorism, calling for a boost in investment, resources, staff, and authorities. Mary, specifically, your great successor, I guess you would say, Matt Olson, again, UVA alum, announced in congressional hearing earlier this year, the establishment of a domestic National Security Division domestic terrorism unit. Can you talk to us a little bit about what you think that unit should do?
So, I don't know a lot of the details of how it's panning out. I suspect that the National Security Division has always had a counterterrorism unit, and these are prosecutors at DOJ working directly with prosecutors at the U.S. Attorney's offices, and of course with FBI, both in Washington Washington home headquarters, as well as out in the field. And they've been primarily the prosecutors, along with the AUSAs, that work with investigators to develop and bring international terrorism cases. again, they could be bringing domestic terrorism cases to the extent that there are terrorism statutes that apply to those. And oftentimes they might bring cases, might be involved in cases where other charges are brought, like firearms charges and things like that. Just like in the international space, sometimes you don't charge a material support to an FTO. Sometimes you charge a weapons offense or lying to the FBI or something like that. So, but the way it's been historically until this new announcement, all the counterterrorism prosecutors just work together, during all types of terrorism. And, I'll be honest, like there was fewer resources and less effort toward the domestic threat for all the reasons we've been discussing. And we also, 2014, ISIS declared a caliphate. Our pace was greater than we had seen since right after 9/11. And, the FBI had tons of cases open and we were bringing tons of cases. So I think now the idea was, counterterrorism prosecutors, just like FBI agents, got very, very smart about certain organizations, right? Because you're working those cases, you're studying their modus operandi, how they recruit, how they propagandize, how they plan, all that, and you're really getting steeped in it. And so I think the idea here is to have some prosecutors who aren't wearing multiple hats, trying to deal with multiple kinds of threats, who can really focus on the domestic threat, whether it is racially motivated extremism, anti-government extremism, anarchist extremism, Islamist extremism, should be, they can kind of get steeped in it. I don't know, what the measurables are on that so far. I don't know how many people are designated to that. I personally, because I guess I kind of like being a generalist, always have as a prosecutor, and even now in my litigation, I do think it's possible for these prosecutors to do both, but I don't see any harm at all. And there certainly could be some efficiencies to having that kind of specialization.
Yeah, I think in part what it signifies is until something's a priority, it's not a priority. And so by establishing a focused unit,
put a name on it.
Yep. I agree with that. So Clint, we've got, just a few minutes here left, and wanted to ask you a little bit. I've talked about DHS. You've talked about DHS. You've been around in a bunch of different buckets. You've talked about the National Counterterrorism Center. Can you, maybe tell us a little bit about what the interagency coordination aspect and how complicated that is? And then if you think you have got a few minutes, then maybe talk to us a little about the role of the private sector. Mary earlier on talked about or alluded to a group called the Global Forum for the GIFCT, the Global International Forum for Counterterrorism. So maybe talk, a little bit about interagency coordination, then what the private sector's role is here.
Yeah. So Chris, in the interagency, it gets really, really difficult because what essentially is permitted, right? I think that's the big thing. So DHS is a way to think about it is more vulnerability, right? So they're trying to protect against assets. That's a vulnerability assessment. So if there's direct threats, then that allows them to sort of say, okay, we have a directed threat. Let's look at all the agencies in DHS or at the federal level, which could be the FBI, to initiate an investigation. But then it comes down to what can they look for and how and where will they do it? And, I always kind of talk about the early days after 9/11. If someone had said death to America, they had an FBI agent show up at their house, right? It was like all leads had to be covered. If you did that today, you need at least 100,000 more FBI agents or DHS or, TSA or whoever it might be. So it's just not feasible to do that. You have to come up with some sort of triage system. I think it's very difficult for the Department of Homeland Security to figure out how do you protect your assets or the homeland, your infrastructure, whatever it might be from a domestic terrorism perspective, when you don't really know where to look or what to look for, and you're not in an investigative approach. That's why on the threat side, which is the FBI principally, but even other law enforcement entities, they're the only ones that really have the authority to go and be more preemptive and sort of be the linkage with DHS. And that's what those fusion centers were for 20 years ago that we started building, was bringing all those people together so they could quickly relay threats, do vulnerability assessments, put out bulletins from DHS and FBI in joint fashion. So that part is happening, but you're still not talking about groups. You'd be talking about an individual. And that's just not accurate of the threat. It's really hard to formulate those. So you'll see kind of a bulletin that'll say militia groups might threaten election infrastructure is a great example. Heading into election 2022, it's already happening. but they don't put enough specifics on it to where that's where the trickle down effect comes. So state and local law enforcement are the ones that are going to sense all of these things this time around in the election as we move into it. In election years is when domestic terrorism picks up. That's when people are motivated around political and social ideologies because they expect an outcome. That leads to political leaders using heated speech to try and inspire people. And 1 in 100 that takes it for real. They take it to the next level. So it's the state and locals. And there's the added wrinkle, which is a lot of the locals are elected. They're elected law enforcement. And there's a degree in this country right now of being a sort of a partisan elected official that is reinforcing one agenda to include the integrity of the election. That's our biggest challenge, I think, going into this election cycle, which is the vote counters, the vote defenders, the protectors of the election integrity. They're also using this to their own advantage. They're using the politics and they're inspiring action. So one of the scenarios that I'm particularly worried about is a candidate at a local level uses a militia as sort of a Praetorian guard or to intimidate people at a local polling place. And oh, by the way, they also are in charge of law enforcement. So, or they have dual membership between these sort of militia type groups and law enforcement. I'm deeply frightened about this going in at a local level because there's no real way for people who are just giving, their free time oftentimes to work elections or very low paid jobs, just being intimidated and coerced. I think that's where it comes to.
Could I just interject one thought with that I think flows? Your point is so good, and it's one of the list of things that keeps me up at night, Chris, because we have this movement in this country, something called constitutional sheriffs, which is not a thing. It's a made-up thing. They have an organization, the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association. It's headed by a longtime board member of none other than the Oath Keepers, the very militia organization, some members of which are charged with seditious conspiracy. But their belief is, and this is what they train other sheriffs who want to be part of this movement, is that they're the highest law enforcement in the land. They say their authority is higher even than the president of the United States because they answer to the Constitution. But of course, it's the Constitution as they decide they want to interpret it. So, for example, the constitutional sheriff in Michigan, after the plot to kidnap Governor Whitmer was exposed, he made some excuses. Maybe they were trying to commit a citizen's arrest. He later tried to get information to seize voting machines after the 2020 election. So this scenario that Clint just painted, that is not a crazy scenario. These are things based on what we know exists out there among belief systems.
Well, I think what you've both done here is in this at the perfect point. We are unfortunately at time, but I assume when Larry watches this or if he's watching remotely, he has an idea for a follow-on event as November 2022 approaches, and certainly as we look forward to or don't look forward to November of 2024. So I want to thank both of you, Mary and Clint, for your time this evening. It really has been an enlightening conversation, a masterclass, as I commented earlier. I want to thank everybody for joining this evening, and thank you to Larry Sabato and the UVA Center for Politics for this evening's event, and hope everyone has a great evening.